This is Transparency, a podcast by Gender Dysphoria Alliance, hosted by Aaron Kimberly and Aaron Terrell. Each week we'll be joined by people who have personal or professional experience with gender dysphoria and physical transition. We'll also discuss how our trans experiences relate to the concept of gender identity. Join us for a compassionate yet heterodox approach to the question of trans.
All right, welcome back to Transparency, everyone. I've got my co-host here, Aaron Terrell. How are you doing, Aaron?
Doing well this morning. Yourself?
Good. Surviving the heat here and probably down there as well. And our guest today is Shannon Boschy. Shannon, we've met a few times here, but could you introduce yourself for our audience? Just a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, I'm a chartered investment manager in Ottawa. I've been in the financial business for 20 years. That career path was sort of a means of carrying water and chop wood, put on a costume. I grew up in Vancouver and spent the 90s in the art scene. In Vancouver, I studied creative writing at the University of British Columbia, which was a portfolio program at the time. Only took a few students in every year. I think it was probably 18 in my cohort. And surrounded by other artists in Vancouver, playwrights and musicians and theater people and personalities, and like rubbing shoulders with people like Michael Bublé before he launched into his fame and folks like that. I've always had a very deep interest in psychology. And because of my upbringing, which was in a very orthodox Christian home, very rigid, I became very curious about philosophy, psychology. I have a deep interest in classical mythology and global storytelling, sacred stories. And I've studied the, let's say, the wisdom traditions of the world over the last 30 years. I spent a lot of time on people like Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung. And I would say I've got my 10,000 hours in that department, just like I have that in my financial career. And a big interest is in development, how we develop, how we grow, how we heal. What are the aspirational goals of humanity? What are the big questions that we can ask? And a couple of years ago, I took a year of sabbatical, and I wrote down some of those meditations into what looks like a book. It was an exploration of sacred storytelling in structure, because I'd spent time with an Indigenous traditional storyteller, carver, and painter who very much inspired me in those years in the 90s. The biggest question that a person can ask, I believe, if we engage in any of these patterns of development from any of the major traditions or even ancient traditions, is a rite of passage question that is, who am I? And I was, I guess, jumped into this world of gender ideology and gender identity and how it's impacting our society several years ago, because a family member has been affected by this, and then I care for them very, very much, and unfortunately our relationship has collapsed because of it. Like many other parents, I think thousands of other parents who have questioned this. My sin in that case was to ask about the side effects of testosterone, and that ended our relationship. So I've spent the last 15 months very much doing a deep dive into what all this means and asking some of those big questions. And kind of from my background and my view on the sacredness of the kinds of questions we can ask as human beings, the question of what's my gender has never existed. Who am I is very different from what am I. And we have this need. It's like a religious socket or a spiritual socket in our lives that has to do with sorting meaning out. And unfortunately, so many people, I believe, had plugged into this question, what's my gender, instead of the bigger questions like, what's my soul? What's my true spiritual nature? And I'm not a joiner. I don't belong to any religion or practice any specific religious tradition, although I practice yoga and meditation for a long time, just as a physical and sort of meditative discipline. A lot of people talk about the meaning crisis, and I think we're in it.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a symptom of it.
Yeah, so you came to the issue through your personal life, but it's intersected with your professional life in some interesting ways. And you wrote an article for your Substack recently that I thought was spot on and a perspective I hadn't heard before. So you brought in concepts from the stock market bubble and comparing that to what you're seeing with trans ideology and how that's playing out societally. Can you kind of walk us through a little bit of what you said in that article?
Sure. I think it's a sociological phenomenon. A stock market bubble hits us, or the bursting of a bubble hits us every 7 to 10 years. We had the technology bubble that burst at the end of the 20th century, the turn of the century, when the internet was just being born. We had companies in Canada like Nortel Networks and JDS Uniphase. Silicon Valley was exploding at the same time in the U.S. In Ottawa, we were called Silicon Valley North. We had some of the greatest minds in technology here, and a lot of back and forth between Silicon Valley. People got very excited about the potential of the internet, and were willing to pay anything for shares in companies because this was supposed to be the future. Unfortunately, they got there about 15 years too early, and a lot of these companies ended up being worthless. And we had the collapse. And the NASDAQ, that's the index that measures the value of technology shares, collapsed by 75% at the time. And then in our more recent memories, the US housing crisis and the global financial crisis, where free money, like low interest rates, made money very accessible for home buyers. Lenders got in on the action as interest rates went down, mortgage payment amounts went down, and the value of homes went up commensurate with it. And so we saw this big spike in the US, predatory lenders just giving out, they call them liar loans or ninja loans. Ninja stands for no income, no job. People were just able to say, my uncle wrote me a thing that says I work for him full time and make $80,000 a year on a piece of paper. And lenders were handing out these super cheap mortgages, but they had teaser rates on them. And those teaser rates are a bit like the department store credit card, where you go, don't pay for 9 months. And if you wait 9 months and a day, they charge you 28% interest, and they really hammer you with penalties retroactive. So a lot of these mortgages were set up this way. People were making money hand over fist. Houses were going up in value, thought the party would never end. On New York Stock Exchange, they were repackaging these bad mortgages into giant buckets, and stripping out them in various layers of income and equity and selling them off to global investors as AAA credit. And it turns out they weren't. And so it ground the entire global cash flow liquidity to a halt. I happen to be staying in Markham right now, and my brother-in-law is a senior vice president with one of the big Canadian banks. His job at the time was global counterparty risk. He was the vice president of analyzing other banks' balance sheets in the middle of the financial crisis. He has a lot less hair now, and said that, I've heard him say a few times that we were within like 20 minutes of complete global economic disaster, like the end of the economy. So in these situations, people get greedy, and they look at the graph, and the graph is going up, and they think, wow, that graph is going to keep going up forever. So I better buy now because it's going to go up even higher. And when people buy in, the law of supply and demand says, okay, well, now it's become more scarce, so the price goes up even more. And then more people get attracted to it, and they pay even more. And so it's this doubling down or doubling up of a sentiment that this party's never going to end. And then one day the lights come on, and Warren Buffett says, when the tide goes out, you find out who's been swimming naked. The reality sets in, and then these economic collapses happen. And while those things are happening, there is no voice anywhere other than someone who's sort of put up as this, radical contrarian, who's going to say that cannabis stocks shouldn't be worth, $100 each. They're only worth $3. No one's going to listen. And in the money world, they ridicule those people and they marginalize them, and they don't get jobs, or they get shuffled to, some office in the basement somewhere, and they don't get to participate for being critical. It's a little less abusive than what we're seeing in the world, where we've seen the number of trans identified, especially girls, spiking over the last 7 years, really since 2015 or so. That spike has just been, we get numbers in my hometown of Ottawa. Our hospital CHEO is up 2,000% since 2014, where approximately 8 to 10 people were, children were presenting a year with gender dysphoria. It's now in the range of 250. So that's, 25x. And the Tavistock, as we know, over various periods, 4,400% or 44x. And we're seeing everywhere. And people get into these kind of hysterias, and they think this is the absolute way that things are, and more people pile in, and more clinics open, and there's more emphasis on this as a reality. There's more people joining that culture, and then it swings out of hand. We see these things, we can see them through history. So I was recently really lucky, I can't believe how lucky, to participate in a small group meeting with Nicolas Christakis from Yale, who's probably the world's leading expert on social contagion. And I've read his books several times, where he talks about phenomena of mass psychogenic illness, where groups of people get into hysterias, and it just takes over, and it creates chaos. And we could think of major really dysfunctional and devastating political ideologies in history as these types of mass psychogenic illnesses. And there's a book that's just coming out right now. His name is momentarily escaping me. Matthias Desmet, who's been talking about mass formation, or mass formation psychosis. And he's been researching that for a number of years. He's doing some of the podcasts now. It all kind of fits into the same pattern with slightly different language that we talk about.
And of course, you've both probably read Jack Turbin's latest disaster, where he's contesting the idea that there's been a sex ratio flip, even though every major pediatric gender clinic in the West, BC Children's Hospital, so Canadian hospitals, UK hospitals, as you said, they've all released these graphs showing not only the major exponential growth since 2015, but also that very dramatic sex ratio flip, where I think BC Children's Hospital in 2019 reported that about 75% of the young patients that they were seeing were biologically female. So that's not really contested. That sex ratio flip is well documented in both peer-reviewed journal articles as well as just reports that clinics have released. And so Turbin released this study from surveys. He only looked at 2 years after that period where that exponential growth started. So he wasn't comparing numbers from before that happened compared to now. He was looking at 2 years after that happened. And that survey didn't even collect reliable data about the biological sex of the participants. He just guessed. So,
and that's part of the bubble phenomenon. During the last financial crisis, Bernie Madoff was exposed. Was it the last one? Ponzi schemes and fraudsters and sociopaths taking advantage of the system. We saw before the financial crisis and after the tech bubble an extreme deregulation in the financial markets in the US. So a lot of these big companies like Goldman Sachs were lobbying the government, we need to get rid of these legislations because they're preventing us from making profits. And in Canada, we were about to do the same thing when we elected the Harper government. Stephen Harper was campaigning on deregulating the Canadian banks, the same as the US style, to make us more globally competitive. Fortunately, he didn't act in time, and then he tooted his horn that, we're the most safest financial country in the world because we're properly regulated and all these things. The people pushing boundaries in those environments can do so with impunity when everyone's in a hysteria, when everyone's possessed by greed, and I think right now we're possessed by sort of moral righteousness that's really tied closely with the phenomena of the explosion of trans, because as anyone who speaks about this can really be targeted, in some cases careers destroyed, investigated, losing jobs. It's very brutal the way people are responding with this sort of emotional possession of righteousness that they're doing the right thing, when really silencing the conversation about this is doing a tremendous amount of harm.
I'm curious about what's the difference between, there's obviously bad actors and people who are motivated by greed and taking advantage of the situation for their own benefit. We could say that Turbin among them and many others, but to me it seems like the majority of influential people in this, they're probably acting out of what they believe to be the best thing. Like they're being altruistic from their perspective. Is kind of the fascinating thing to witness.
Mm-hmm. It's certainly not unique in history, and in fact, a lot of human atrocity has been committed under exactly those conditions. People thinking that they're doing the right thing and then justifying the atrocities with a sense of moral righteousness. Like, this must be done for the good of the greater society, or even in the case of so many kids who are being medicalized, for the good of the children. With these bubbles, the formation that we see right now, when we compare the graph of the explosion in numbers of trans identification presentation to gender clinics of kids, looks exactly like some of the major spikes in stock market bubbles. The graph just goes pretty much stratospheric, and then it comes down just as fast. I hesitate to make predictions, and we're starting to see some of the cascading stories that indicate that we might be at a point where this could be popping. The closure of the Tavistock kids, and following on the release of the interim CAS report, where they restricted sort of interventions at the Tavistock for kids under 18, and now ordering them closed by next year. All kinds of breaking news. Like last week in the UK, or 10 days ago in the UK, there was probably 3 or 4 major stories about vindications of people who are pushing back against this kind of ideological fervor. I can't remember the woman's name who fought against her law society for believing in biological sex, and having been discriminated against and losing her job, her role there, because of her statements about the reality of biological sex. Mm-hmm. And the courts vindicated her. So there's a lot of this stuff that's happening, and similar to when the U.S. crisis began to unwind, there was some news like this. There's some problem over here, and people who were trying to articulate the problem and communicate it to the regulators, to the public, to investors, to the ratings agencies like Standard & Poor's, who just nobody wanted to listen. Suddenly, there's some head scratching going on, could this be a possibility? And that was May of 2007. And by September of 2007, only a couple of months, there was major government intervention. And then it took another year for that to really process. So September of 07 to September of 08. 08, we saw that moment where my brother-in-law describes it as like we were this close to the end of the world. And then it was digested out by about March of the following year. So it created a really monumental emotional shift from greed, unbridled, to fear. Those are the two markets that really run the investment world. And humans have had like strictures against unbridled greed for a very long time. It's one of the sins, right? Another one is pride, and pride, as it translates, as one of the classic cardinal sins, the sins of the four directions, is like narcissistic belief in an idea, like I'm so smart and I'm so right, and I'm not going to let anybody else tell me anything, and I'm gonna move through the world like that. That's one of the other sins, and that's kind of what I believe were the flavor or the driver, the sin that's behind some of this. There are others, but that's what I wrote about in my piece on Substack.
One of the things that we're trying to do with the Gender Dysphoria Alliance is clarify what is gender dysphoria, to really highlight the fact that what's happening right now, especially since that, around that 2015 period and that huge spike, that really has nothing to do with gender dysphoria. But the whole movement is, under the guise of supporting those of us who had gender dysphoria, when really it has nothing to do with gender dysphoria. And unfortunately, it's people with gender dysphoria that are going to experience the hardship of when this thing crashes. But what's happened, this sort of mass formation that's happened, it's very ideological, coupled with money.
Yeah.
And actually at the expense of evidence-based treatment and understanding of gender dysphoria.
Yeah. That's the parallel when the regulations get thrown out, right? Scientific process, the Hippocratic oath versus do no harm, the gatekeeping boundaries that were, demanded to be removed over the last few years as being transphobic, and all those barriers that protected people have been torn away, just like the deregulation in the U.S. banks over greed. And possibly that was in some way altruistically motivated. We don't really know. Possibly there was more sort of selfish, sort of large scale corporate, pharmaceutical. I see the Dentons report and recommendations have surfaced again online. I was seeing it, retweeted and moving around Twitter in the last week or so. That was the report by the law firm Dentons, that was paid for in part by the Thomson Reuters Foundation, on how to basically insinuate gender self-identification and replace biological sex identification with gender self-identification in institutions, governments, schools, laws, and to do so under the radar, to hide it, because the perception or the kind of understanding was that it would create pushback if it went through normal legislative processes. So we've got a very insidious, kind of deliberately under or in the shadows kind of attempts to insinuate gender ideology into institutions all over the world.
Which is exactly what, I haven't studied the conversion therapy legislation that's happened in other countries, but I've certainly read through the legislation here in Canada. And that's exactly what that legislation is doing. It's, how much conversion therapy were we actually seeing here in Canada? And there's no research on the impact of psychotherapy on gender dysphoria. They're conflating conversion efforts that have been done in the past for homosexuality and conflating that with what they're claiming as conversion efforts for gender dysphoria. But really the whole point of that legislation was to through a backdoor hidden attempt to code queer theory into law and legislation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of people are asking that question. What is gender dysphoria? Um, is it the same phenomena that's happening, or is it something else? A lot of people are asking the questions about social contagion in different language, like mass hysteria or mass formation or psychogenic illness, or uh, and I've been asking ever since this really hit me um, at the beginning of last summer. What can I do about this? Um, and I know that a lot of people are asking the same question. Like, they're concerned about family members, they're concerned about what's happening in the school environments that they're teaching in, they're concerned about sex-based rights that are being violated. There are many people who are aware of what's going on, and incredible people doing work all over in their own ways with their own talents and abilities um, to push back on this. And so I was asking myself, by the way, you guys, I'm really glad to be chatting with you today. I've been following your work since, oh gosh, when I first tuned into you, you had a little website that was held together by bubblegum and duct tape, and then you kind of exploded. And the kind of the kind of honesty and vulnerability that you both shared along with your guests in the last year has just been really inspiring to a lot of people. So last year, Pamela Buffoni, who lives not far from me from Ottawa, her and I had been chatting a little bit. And for viewers who don't know Pamela Buffoni, she put a case before the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal because her 6-year-old daughter, a little more than 4 years ago, was taught in grade 1 by a teacher that there was no such thing as boys and girls, and that boys could be girls and girls could be boys. And I believe that the teacher showed a couple of videos relative to this. It was a teaching opportunity or a teaching moment, and Pamela's daughter was quite distressed, and so she went to see the teacher, and the teacher insisted that this was appropriate to teach children, like the social constructionism of gender, that we make up boys and we make up girls. And the teacher was, immovable, and so Pamela went to the principal, and the principal doubled down, and then the school board backed the principal that this is appropriate to teach 6-year-olds. So I was speaking with Pamela and asking and thinking about this lever. So I've got a pretty good professional network. I've made my career connecting people to other people, and sometimes those people become my clients. But most of the time, I'm facilitating it. Connections and understanding goals of people and saying, how can I help you achieve your goals? And then along the way, my business has been a great collateral of that. And I've developed a pretty good LinkedIn network local to Ottawa for me, where I've connected with a lot of business owners and professionals and lawyers and accountants. And I said, I think I'm going to start talking about this on LinkedIn. It's not the appropriate platform for it, but I got to do something. And she said, well, maybe think about that a bit. But Chris Elston, Billboard Chris, is in town tomorrow. Maybe you should connect with him. So I met with Chris on a Monday afternoon. He had been smeared in the media by the person who's now our leading mayoral candidate for the Ottawa elections in October, as hateful and bigoted, and all the attacks that anyone who raises questions gets. And I talked to him, and he said, well, I was going to leave tonight, but I don't want to feel like I'm being run out of town. So I'm going to stand on the public street across from a high school tomorrow if you want to join me. And I said, yeah, of course. And then Chanel Fall, I don't know if you guys know Chanel, who's also in Ottawa, and I'm hoping she'll run as trustee along with me on a slate to try and take the school board back from the brink of this. She joined us. Chris was assaulted within about 5 minutes of us taking out the signs and standing on the corner. The car slammed on its brakes, and the guy got out and started pushing him around and yelling just bizarre accusations about us violating his rights by being on a public street and exercising freedom of expression. And then the next day, between the OCDSB sending a letter to everybody in the school district, all parents and faculty, about hate and bigotry and no room for this, and Catherine McKenney, who's running for mayor, getting on media and saying the same thing. They whipped up the Rainbow Carleton Coalition, which is the two university activist groups, and we were mobbed by about 300 people. Chris was, again, he was shoved around and prodded and spray painted and had liquid poured on him, and the police sort of looked on while his car was vandalized, and I walked away from that completely stunned. Like, what? Like, this is way bigger and way scarier than I thought. And all these people were calling us bullies. They're calling us the angry ones. They're telling us that we're wishing violence and death on trans people. And there are so many people with good hearts who are trying to raise awareness of this. Gender dysphoria is, from what I'm understanding, is like, it's a very difficult experience, and I've heard you guys talk about it. And it's not to be minimized at all. And we need appropriate pathways, evidence-based, to help people. So after that, I in my networking exercises, I met a woman I'd known for some time, but she is the president of a leading artificial intelligence machine learning company. And there's a few really interesting ones in Canada. She has had concerns herself about what she's seeing with friends of her children, and experienced some of the really aggressive pushback from one of her kids about getting someone's pronouns right or wrong, and being phobic and all of that stuff. And she kind of said, well, like, I'm worried about this. Why don't I run a query and see what's happened? So she deployed this machine learning tool, and the tool does things like market research and behavioral decision-making analysis from publicly available data on the internet, Twitter, Reddit, various other text-based platforms. And they become really good because they can get big sample sizes of the population in determining public opinion, way better than traditional polling methods. And what we saw in 2016 and in the 2020 elections is our traditional polling methods of phone calling are failing. And so some of these technological tools that involve learning algorithms, artificial intelligence, start to help to map some of how these decisions get made. And she was able to say, well, we got kind of an aggregate and identified about 75,000 conversations happening about this in Canada. And it spiked after this event because of what happened to you guys and the impact on the media and the social media conversations that happened. So, Chris Elston, Billboard Chris, his goal is to simulate conversation. So we were able to get data to say, you're doing it, it's working. And we were able to get data that said the overwhelming, maybe a stretch of a word, but more than 60% of the general public was against puberty blockers and these types of medical interventions on kids. Whereas the activists would like us to believe that, critics are in the minority. Most people aren't really on board with this. So that began a conversation, and Pamela, through GenSpec and through some of her connections, said, well, would you like me to introduce you to Lisa? And so began a conversation with Lisa Littman. We invited Lisa Marciano, who's a Jungian analyst, to be part of our advisory group. She published in 2016 about social contagion and Quillette. Had some conversations.
She was one of the early people raising sounding
out.
Yeah.
Jane Wheeler from Rethink Identity Medicine Ethics. She's incredible. Helena joined our advisory group. Helena Kirshner, who's very well known detransitioner, and some others who I can't name because of their current positions, but we have a cognitive scientist who's advising us. So we've got Littman Research Foundation and we're preparing to launch, to fund and launch a formal medium-term artificial intelligence mapping of what's happening online and what's been happening since as far back as 2012. So this tool, because data on the internet never goes away, our first stage is going to be just to go out and identify a large sample group. And people who follow this may know that Lisa Littman has faced a lot of criticism. One of the criticisms is a sampling method that's sort of part of the nature of work that she's doing. She's doing qualitative analysis with relatively small groups of people to understand trends and patterns. The ROGD label has been misconstrued many times as a diagnosis, which it's not. It's a descriptive term, and she's faced all kinds of criticism. But it looks like we'll be able to put together independent, peer-reviewable data sets with sample populations in the tens of thousands of people. And we'll be able to go back in time with the data and research to understand how this trend has emerged, what some of the outside influences have been. For example, I Am Jazz, reality TV in 2015, Caitlyn Jenner, and there's been a lot of public awareness rising as this has been happening. And I've likened this, so I've traveled a lot in my life. And I draw a distinction. I learned this from someone I met tree planting in northern BC when I was in university, who said the difference between a traveler and a tourist is the traveler goes to see what's there, while the tourist goes to see what they want to see. So we're going to deploy this algorithm as a traveler into these spaces, Twitter, Tumblr, and Reddit. And we're going to be able to identify these unique, independent data points or I guess people, and strip all of the identifiers away. So for ethical reasons, we never want to have any identifiers in this kind of research. We want to understand what's happening in aggregate. And the machine learning has the ability to find independent inputs by the tens of thousands, and then to identify patterns, patterns of decision-making, patterns of influence, patterns of persuasion, new memes is a funny word because we think of memes as like a little cutter on Facebook that's got a funny expression, but Richard Dawkins coined the term memes or memetics to represent like a unit of culture, a discrete unit. So we'll be able to see these discrete sort of subcultures on the internet, how they interact, how people might move from outside one culture and be drawn into it, or how they might exit it. So when I translate that into simple language, we will be able to see patterns of how people make decisions to change their pronouns. Are there people influencing them? Are there sort of social currencies associated with it? All of this is speculation, right? Like I don't know. We have a sense of a map before we go traveling, but we don't know what we're going to see when we get there. And we may be able to identify patterns of people deciding to detransition and what that looks like. And to see influences like advertising or influencer marketing that's happening. I just thought it was terrifying. A few days ago on Twitter, someone screenshotted on Twitter a group of people offering to basically sell their extra hormones, whether testosterone or estradiol, to people who couldn't get it or needed to get it, quietly or whatever, and basically practicing medicine without a license. There's a big interest for Jane Wheeler and Rethink Identity Medicine Ethics, who's looking at kind of dark persuasion and efforts to get behind restrictions on marketing of medical practices online, things like that.
Yeah, there have been a lot of web pop-ups of showing people how to get hormones without a prescription, ordering it online. It's horrifying. I mean, they don't want gatekeeping as far as, going to see a physician, and now they want to even eliminate the physician. Might as well just put hormones in vending machines and hand them out like candy.
Yeah. So our we may be able to see those things. And one of the biggest things that, because I've got an incredible board of advisors working together on this, the scientists want to have a really clear question formulated. And it's hard for us to kind of grapple with, well, we're just going to let this machine run or this process run for 6 or 8 weeks to get the map. And there's going to be data sets and reports we're going to be able to get out of this. These are peer reviewable quality, and they've been vetted and published. The processes and the mathematics have been published, so we can count on the data that we get out of this. And then we'll be able to hone our questions in. What's happening over here? What's happening over here? And with our advisory group, be able to prioritize the kind of questions that we want to ask. Like I asked myself, what's the biggest lever I could possibly pull to have an impact on what's happening? We'll be able to collaborate together and say, what's the biggest question that we want to ask?
This project right here could be that lever, honestly, once that data is available. Yeah. I've spent like the last 5 years, I want to say, just in different trans forums and kind of educating myself almost like an anthropologist of what's changed, what's going on, what people are thinking. And it's like, oh, this has so many likes, so like this post is absolutely confounding to me, but 5,000 people have liked it. It's like, obviously it people believe this and relate with this. And so I've just been like doing that kind of just as an individual and just kind of like in my mind, kind of figuring out the patterns and whatnot. But this is like going to do that like actually usable and large scale and translatable.
Yeah, exactly. And like you, a lot of testimonials. Like you guys have had Helena on your show. Her testimony of her experience on Tumblr and how she kind of incrementally went down that pathway. We have those anecdotally, and so we'll be able to affirm to the degree that these are real experiences in a peer reviewable large data set that will help us talk about this better, talk about it with legislators, talk about it with therapists, talk about it with parents, talk about it with teachers. And if this could be a tiny part of popping this bubble, that might be one of the most important things I ever do.
Yeah, I think it'll be a big part. Go on.
Yeah. We're in the phase right now of fundraising. So I've committed $5,000 to the project. The total cost, Canadian, the total cost is going to be about 40,000 American. We have some other contributors who are connected with the project who are contributing as well. But I'm submitting a piece to PIT, Parents with Inconvenient Truths About Trans, that describes this. And over the next probably 3 or 4 weeks, I'm going to be hosting some information sessions for people who are interested in supporting the project and getting this off the ground. What do they say? The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is now. So we're hoping to get this, and maybe we'll get initial results if we can get enough commitment. I'd like to see half of the financial commitment in place before giving the green light to the firm, but they have the project all mapped out. It's basically like press the button, we're going to go, and really light this up, and then bring that to the public and global conversation in the next few months.
If people want to contribute financially to the project, how can they do that?
At this point, reach out to me. And we have pathways in the States, depending on the level of contribution, where we may be able to get a tax deduction through a 501c3 charitable organization. Charitable status in Canada is a little more difficult. So I don't expect to be able to get a tax deduction for my contribution, but that's just what it is. And I'm forming the framework right now for the nonprofit organization to incorporate here in Canada and to be able to receive money from the charities in the States. And then as this project moves ahead, I'll apply and use some of my my professional experience in the financial world. Will apply for charitable status once we have a viable, ongoing sort of data collection mechanism. I really believe that at a certain point the government's going to fund this, because it's going to, just like when the government stepped in when the financial crisis burst and they shored up corporations and they lent money to places and they funded things to create the solutions. I think that there come a time shortly where there's going to be enough public outcry that the government is going to have to step in, and maybe they'll fund us, or maybe they'll deploy other resources or combinations of such to help mitigate the damage that we're seeing. 250 kids a year going through CHEO. I read that there's 100 gender clinics across Canada now in varying configurations. And, we've got the major hospital, BC Children's Hospital, and Sick Kids in Toronto that are doing this, and talking about backlogs, and yet we know that the high probability of health implications for these kids long term.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see what data we're able to get from the project. That's what we're so desperately needing right now. It's not more ideology and more politics. We need more.
Let's get some objective information about what's happening, and then talk about that openly.
And you say that's the results are going to be in within a few months of launching. Is that what you're?
Yeah, something between 4 and 8 weeks, and we have to tune the inquiry a little bit to identify where our samples are. So it's not going to be we're identifying the whole internet as our sample population. It's going to be people who have some indications or trigger some of the machine learning to say this is a person who is kind of in this culture or relative to this environment in this conversation.
So that initial data run will be, you described it as a map, so you'll get sort of some preliminary data, and then you can fine tune it and ask specific questions based on that preliminary data.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. Forgive me if because we talked briefly before our recording, so I'm not sure if I'm repeating myself again, but in the last federal Canadian election, what this tool found was that in the last 10 days or so before the election, the conversation around abortion rights and pro-choice versus legislation came up in Canada because of events that were taking place in Texas. So Texas, Bill Abbott and the Texas legislature was pushing very restrictive abortion legislation. And that spilled over into Canada. Now, none of the political candidates or parties had any conversation about abortion rights or restrictions. But the AI identified it as a significant conversation point that could tilt a significant number of voters if somebody played that card. Now, this firm, remember back in 2016, or actually it was 2017 by the time we figured this out, it was a company called Cambridge Analytica that was using micro-targeting to influence voters in the US. And they were hired by the Republicans. And this was a very manipulative way of kind of figuring out how people make decisions and then nudging them with direct micro-targeted ads. The Cambridge Analytica system is similar to what this system is, but in the kind of hacker online world, we distinguish between good actors and bad actors, white hats versus black hats. So this organization is very and I've known the CEO and the chief scientist for probably, I've known the CEO for at least 10 years. They are very ethical in their use of data, and that's been part of our conversation. So they recognize the profound impact that technology like this can have, and protect how it can be used, which I appreciate a lot.
One thing I keep wondering is what you obviously are very familiar with bubbles and the bursting. In the past, when we talk about like financial bubbles and whatnot, the impact, well, like in the housing crisis, that was obviously felt very, very far reaching into individual lives. But I think this is going to take it's going to look very different when the bubble bursts, as far as individual families, institutions,
Yeah.
like all the backing, like things that were going on financially, that happens, offline behind closed doors. These are individual financial decisions and, strategies but this has all been so completely public and individual, like people's health, in family structures, and like all these things are so visible. Do you have any thoughts on what that's going to look like? This specific, I think I think we're seeing that we're going to see the end of this within 2 to 5 years is my estimation, a very uneducated estimation. But I just can't stop thinking about what it's going to look like after the fact.
Yeah, I think it's a question so many of us are asking. Is this going to end? How is it going to end? When's it going to end? If this follows the pattern of a bubble bursting, it bursts very quickly. And the graph that went straight up ends up coming almost straight down. So, I mean, that's the case with Tavistock. Their graph went straight up. They're not treating people anymore. And so the graph has gone straight down. The financial bubble, when it burst, we're still feeling impacts of that. That was 14 years ago. The economic impacts of that have had long-term consequences to the general public in the United States. The gap between the rich and the poor over the last decade has dramatically widened. People are suffering and frustrated, and then a lot of that came out during COVID with anxiety and resentment and pushback against government, and this anti-capitalist sentiment we're seeing an awful lot of. As the gender bubble bursts, if that's the pattern that it follows, I don't think we're going to see an increased trust in institutions. There's going to be an awful lot of questions. There's going to be major inquiries, congressional inquiries in the United States. There's going to be royal commissions of inquiry here in Canada. We'll have similar undertakings, and hopefully with more strident structuring to the inquiries into missing and murdered Indigenous women, or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that we had in Canada in the last 10 years, and the results of the inquiries into residential schools and our treatment of Indigenous here in Canada. That's the level of healing. That's the level of transparency that we're going to have to go through to make sense of this. And there are a lot of human casualties here. A lot of people in the States, in the financial bubble, they lost their homes, they lost everything. The companies that they worked for just stopped existing. Places were gutted in terms of real estate. Places like Detroit, Las Vegas was hit really hard. Like many, many cities in the States were just devastated by the collapse of the real estate market. And we're going to see, obviously in different flavors, but there's going to be questions within school systems and at all levels of government. And because, we've heard a lot about systemic racism and systemic, right? This is the sort of wokeness of systemic privilege, but we have basically a school to medicalization pipeline happening in Canada. Kids are being taught in grade 1 that there's no such thing as biological sex, and this is defended, right? And you can be a boy or you can be a girl. So at that level of psychological development, kids don't have the capacity to comprehend this. I mean, the question of who you are, and I would put it to viewers and maybe to you guys as well. Like, I think we're all about the same age. I turned 50 not long ago, and I still don't have a full answer to that question. Who I am is constantly evolving, and I get to know myself better and better the older I get. I feel like I become more myself. Mm-hmm. We're going to be asking ourselves that question everywhere these institutions have been part of the system. So the schools are. Someone in BC contacted me. He said, "What should I do? My kid was exposed to this at their preschool in literature, and they're about to go to kindergarten. And so the preschool is part of this systemic problem. The schools and SOGI in BC is part of the systemic problems. And then we have, the internet is part of the systemic problem. We have it legislated as part of the problem. We have, the human rights capture of human rights legislation, interpretations of what human rights are in this context. It's all like spread tentacles everywhere. So how do we unwind that? How do we reconcile that? It's a bigger question. What's the biggest lever
for me? Especially for those of us on the left, because it's become such a polarized, divided, divisive issue that tends to be split down party lines. And I think, it tends to be left-leaning people that are full on board with these ideologies.
Yeah. Partly that's a oppositional defiance to the right, because we're just going to categorically reject anything you say because you're you and you're on the right. And part of that is the virtue signaling and this sort of moral sense of superiority that we're doing the right thing, misguided, a lack of understanding of what trans and what gender dysphoria is, the conflation of trans with gay and lesbian, or gender dysphoria with who you're attracted to, and the rainbow industry, the pride industry, the ESG. I mean, from the investment world, ESG is toxic in 100 different ways. But companies now fight because they get ranked on these environmental, social, and governance criteria on a real-time basis, and that has an impact on their stock value. So there's perverse incentives in corporations, like, there's a bank in Canada, I'm not going to name it, but like Forever Progressing, and the rainbows just wraps their building, and this is the bank. So it's very hard when these progressive ideas are cloaked in virtue, and everywhere we turn to be the person who says, whoa, like we need to pump the brakes. And I come from the left. I voted Liberal for 30 years. Very consistently, I have a strong belief in social institutions and, social support and giving people a hand up in life and helping, rather than individualism. But the left has just gone way left, and now I'm frequently called a white supremacist and a bigot and a transphobe and a Nazi, and like we've all been called it all at this point.
Well, thanks so much for coming on and talking to us. I'm really excited for your project, and I'm looking forward to seeing that when it's finally published.
Me too. I hope it makes a difference. And if anyone would like any more information or to know when we're going to give some information sessions, I'm going to try and invite some of our board into each of those meetings so that we have someone from the team represented in those conversations. And we're putting together a white paper, finalizing right now. So, the piece that's going up in Pitt is general. And I've talked in generalities here, but we want to contextualize what we're doing with a good, rigorous scientific background. And that's not my, I'm finance, that's the world that I live in, but the people who are coming from the science side really want to make sure that we're clear about what this is about and provide the proper context and the proper references and, and then to seat this within the best possible scientific rigor that we can apply.
I think it's going to have a massive and very, very useful impact. So thank you very much for doing that.
It's my duty. I just happen to be a guy who knows people who connect people, and
that's I was just gonna say that's all we can do is whatever we can do, whatever our speciality is, whatever we can contribute. It's like contribute that. That's
Yeah, it's definitely a welcome contribution. Yeah, well, thanks so much. It's been great to talk to you again.
Thank you guys, and Aaron, it's great seeing you again. I was going to try and get out to BC again this fall. That's not going to happen, but I got word my stepson's moving to Kelowna. So we have an excuse to get kind of in your neck of the woods again, maybe in the next year. It'd be great to catch up and
that'll be great.
And have a tea together again. And Aaron T, very nice to meet you.
You as well.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Transparency Podcast. If you enjoy our content, please help out our algorithm by hitting like or subscribe. If you'd like to make a donation, follow the link to our PayPal account. On behalf of the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, thanks for your support.